Namaskar. Hello and welcome to this special session of P Gurus. And today we have with us a former Minister of State for External Affairs, Sri J Akbar, who has had extensive contacts with not only the current leadership of Russia, but with Russia in general. He is now joining us to share his thoughts on the Russian mindset. What is going on? Are they going to stop with Ukraine, or are they going to gobble up other countries also? What's going to play out? How it's going to play out? To know all these things, we're going to be talking to Sri J Akbar. And today, instead of me hosting it, it's going to be a guest host, Sridhar Chityala ji. At this point, I'd like to hand over the control to Sridhar ji. Sridhar ji, please take over, sir, and you can take it over and start talking to MJ Akbar ji. Akbar ji, namaskar and welcome to P Guru's channel.
Namaskar.
Namaskar and good morning. Good afternoon. Namaskar, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome, MJ. So I think we are in a very precipitous situation, something that we haven't seen since 1941, as they say, in Europe. So how did we get here, sir? How have we landed ourselves here, and how has United States and Europe got us into this Russia-Ukraine mess right now?
See, that one thing, I think it's a bit far-fetched to say that nothing like this has happened since 1941. Europe has been the biggest conflict zone of the Cold War. Now, while the Cold War may not have may not have become warm in Europe, it was became extremely heated across many parts of the world. The Balkans have seen war, right? You remember
Sure.
when Clinton and Tony Blair were leaders of the Anglo-American duo partnership. And the Anglo-American partnership is a critical element of that region because even the Ukraine at the moment, contemporary situation, is largely controlled by the Budapest Memo of 1994, which was signed by America, Britain, Russia, and Ukraine. There has been a continuing story of conflict. Let's get down to the present situation. I think the compelling image so far I've seen in what might be called political terms, not in terms of the war itself, is the image of the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, in a t-shirt, standing, asking the world, he was looking a bit dejected and slightly bewildered, I thought, a bit out of depth, because he could not fully comprehend what was going on. He was asking a very important question, though, which is, why has the world abandoned me? Now, if I think, and with all due respect for him, he'd had a little more experience in international affairs, he would have realized that America and Britain, which were his principal, shall I say, support base, did not abandon him in the last week of February. They abandoned him in the first weeks of December, which is when Russia began to mobilize. And since then, President Putin has been waiting for, it is in his calculation, one thing to happen: a clear answer on whether Ukraine would join NATO or not. Now, this, as you know, is not a new subject. This has been in the forefront of the confrontation, whatever you might like to call it, ever since the end of Second World War and the emergence of NATO. And he did not get the West. As I said, President Biden had two options. One, that it could have said very clearly that no, Ukraine has no place for NATO. No, just in case you think that this is a very far-fetched situation or unrealistic situation, I would like to remind you that one of the most important intellectual political spaces or minds that we have seen in the last 40, 50 years is that of Dr. Henry Kissinger. And Dr. Henry Kissinger by no means can be called a dove. I mean, his reputation is what it is. Dr. Henry Kissinger has made it very clear that Ukraine should have no place in NATO. On the other side, different side of the spectrum, you remember Alexander Solzhenitsyn, author of the Gulag Archipelago, and therefore as anti-Soviet, communist, or perhaps anti-establishment as you could get. He too has written that Ukraine is really essentially a part of Russia, which is not Dr. Kissinger's position, of course, but that I'm just trying to tell you that there is a wide consensus, certainly within Russia, and a very important view taken by some of the best minds in contemporary international relations, which see some importance in the idea that spheres of influence should not be disturbed. And a process that has begun with President Clinton's perhaps over-eager ambitions to take the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union forward by expanding the frontiers of NATO. At some point, Russia's protests had to take some form other than a plea for dialogue. And I think this is where we are at this moment. President Putin certainly waited for an answer. America neither gave an answer, nor, if it was, let's say, determined to back Ukraine, nor did it mobilize. It did not send troops either. Today, President Biden and NATO powers have troops in the Baltics. They have troops in Poland. They have troops in Hungary. They have troops in Romania. But they did not send troops to Ukraine. So the message was very clear that while they gave a lot of vocal support to the Ukraine position, they were not ready to back up their position in the form that really mattered to President Putin, which is, are you going to put muscle behind your words or not? And they had no muscle to offer. They had no muscle to put. And therefore, they tried to basically cover up what certainly Ukraine thinks of as betrayal privately, even if it may not say so, with terms, pompous phrases like strategic ambiguity and so on and so forth. All that President Putin heard from the West was the sound of shifting goalposts, and he had to eventually take action, which he did. But one thing I think one can say about President Putin, which is that a sensible strategist, a sensible leader never begins a war without defining a clear war objective. In 2014, when he moved, he had a clear objective, which was Crimea. Even Crimea, you must understand, or you must realize that Crimea was be handed over to Ukraine only in 1954. Everything has a history. Everything has a history. And, when he saw that there was no answer coming, plus, I think President Putin got the measure of President Biden and Prime Minister Boris Johnson in Kabul in August. When he saw the capitulation of the American and the British forces against the Taliban, even though the Taliban did not, without a fight, without a response, I think he and many leaders across the world made the assessment that all that President Biden had to offer in response to any confrontation was words drafted by someone else. And as we saw that in the latest situation in Ukraine, as the war started, the big message, the big message from President Biden was that he was sending his prayers for, Ukraine. I'm afraid prayers and the other side of the coin, which is sanctions, are not very effective against military armor.
So I think it's a great context and, the perspective behind where we are today. And I think you hit the nail on the head, which is effectively Vladimir has been asking for security guarantees and NATO membership to be denied to Ukraine and asking Ukraine to withdraw the membership that they had sought within NATO. Clearly, Ukraine said it is a sovereign nation, it has a right to choose, and he called it as existential threat. The only question that comes to bear in mind is he chose a very interesting strategy where he waited for the two eastern provinces in the Donbass region to declare sovereignty, and then he passed a recognition in the Duma. Then he used the pretext of the Russian nationals being attacked in the eastern provinces, and then he launched this tirade. So I just don't know from a strategic perspective and from optics, that sounds very reasonable to do this kind of catastrophic damage to the civilians.
Well, I mean, the damage to civilians is one of the most unfortunate aspects of or collateral consequences of conflict. And if I think of all the conflicts that I and you have been witness to in the last 15 years, I mean, as in school in Vietnam, right down to Libya, or right down to Syria, right down to, I mean, just about anything that you choose to mention, whether in the wars, the superpowers were part of them or whether they were just conflicts as in Africa. I mean, unfortunately, civilian damage is a part of, and that is why war is always considered the last option, never by anyone the first option. And as I pointed out, Moscow, President Putin waited from early December right up to end of February to hear something to which he could respond. I can also tell you that President Putin as a leader is hugely unlikely to be frightened by the thought of Aeroflot being stopped at Heathrow Airport, or an oligarch losing his football club or his castle, in London. And sometimes I feel that even the sanctions have a touch of a non-serious element. Boris Johnson, who thinks that he's a successor to Winston Churchill, a very learned person, by the way, I have high respect for him, who thinks that he's a successor of Churchill. I don't know whether history will wonder whether he was not a successor of Chamberlain. I don't know, but I'm just pointing this out. However, the first list, the first sanctions that he began with after the war had begun was, naming 3 people who were on the sanctions list till 2014. And some of the children had become British citizens. Many of them had transferred their shares and so on and so forth. I mean, London did not make much effort to touch the 31 Russian companies who are listed on the London Stock Exchange, right? Whose total value is in hundreds and hundreds of billions of pounds, right? I'm not even mentioning SWIFT because this is the situation is still fluid. So we don't know what will happen tomorrow. But the key aspect, the very important aspect of President Biden's intervention into this sanctions game, when he made this long speech, and there in the middle of the text, sad to say, underreported by media, but there in the middle of the text, but underreported but not unnoticed, was the fact that Russia's energy supplies would never be disrupted. So if you're not going to disrupt Russia's energy supplies, I mean, what kind of sort of punitive action is that? Do you know that between 1st December, when the price of oil was $65 a barrel, and today when the price is around 100 barrels a day, Russia has been making $350 million per day in extra profits because of the price rise. So in a sense, the West is actually financing Moscow's war. With this money, Russia produces 10 million barrels of oil a day. It's probably the second largest producer. So, And sanctions also, you have to remember, it's not a one-way street. The West, the Americans need titanium, they need palladium, they need C4F6, they need scandium, they need neon. The biggest producer of titanium is in Western Siberia. A company called Rostec. Russia has over 40% of palladium reserves. It has about 90% of neon reserves. It is always important to remember, and should have been thought through, that Russia is not Iran, which has only oil. Russia has vast reserves and the capacity to actually take on a confrontation, right? Russia has not been a major power because of communism alone, or because of its economy. It's been a major power for a variety of reasons, which is what I would call geopolitical eco resources. And you take on somebody who understands how to mobilize them. And now President Putin has been in office for over 2 decades, right? He did not begin with confrontation. He very intelligently, he began first by strengthening his own country's economy.
Yeah.
In 10 years, the average economic rate of growth, was more than doubled. The earnings of every Russian in real terms doubled, right? It is only when he had sorted out the mess that he had inherited from his predecessor or predecessors that he began then. And then after that, when he came onto what might be called the strategic map of the world, his intervention in Syria changed the strategic map of West Asia. Now, you must remember that what we call West Asia can also be called Far Europe, because that is in the eastern coast of the Mediterranean.
Yep.
All these countries are in the eastern, so they are actually equally Far Europe. Now, from 2014, he is very clear that he wants to reassert what might be called Russia's strategic security space. In 2014, he moved in Crimea. What did the White House do? It looked the other way and patted itself on the back. The president was Barack Obama, right? In 2015, Ukraine asked for NATO membership. From 2014 to 2022 is 7 years. For 7 years, the West didn't reply. If it really wanted to help Ukraine, he could have made Ukraine a NATO member in the last 7 years, as it made other countries. Why did it not? Why it did not? Because it did not really believe that Ukraine could be defended as a part of the NATO alliance. That is the hard truth. Today, I can say with some confidence that Vladimir Putin, President Putin, has established what I would like to describe as the new normal. That the line of now between Russian sphere of influence and the West has now been drawn at Romania, Poland, and the Baltics, right? With Belarus and Ukraine, clearly a part of the Soviet area of influence. And this, I think, is going to be accepted. There will be much noise. As far as sanctions are concerned, I would just like to remind you, Sridhar, that in 2018, the West passed sanctions or imposed sanctions on a Russian aluminium company. I think its name is Ruslan, right?
Correct.
The price of aluminium shot up. Very quietly, they withdrew the sanctions, and all was well again, right? So, sanctions bit is sometimes can be a very, very toothless tiger.
Right. So I think it's very interesting from the context of the economic power of Russia, and not the mainstream media as well as the global leadership not communicating the strength of the Russian energy and commodity leadership and the consequences to the world. And so, therefore, sanctions will have no effect other than punishing all the nations who are beneficiaries of these products and resources coming from Russia. And SWIFT only will make things worsen for the rest of the world by way of the money flows and the fulfillment of the trade obligations, which is why they chose. The question that begs is, has the world lost leadership, especially in the West, in not only communicating but shaping the destiny of the world better? Always the Eastern nations looked at the West. But what we are witnessing here is a complete lack of communication and the graspness to understand the economic and trade and security consequences.
I think every country gets the leaders it deserves, or it elects, or it finds. But what the West has certainly lost, and it was never more visible to me than in Afghanistan, which still remains one of the improbable stroke impossible events I have witnessed. Once again, the capitulation. I think the West's leadership has lost its knees. It doesn't know how to stand anymore. It keeps talking, and it thinks that bluster is a substitute for troops on the ground or boots on the ground. Strategic space cannot be protected by talk alone, right? And it certainly cannot be. And today, I think some of the Western leaders are facing some very brittle sarcasm. I was reading in the Times London a diarist who said very solemnly that when X happened and Ukraine happened, Liz Truss, the foreign secretary, summoned the Russian ambassador and gave him tea, but she did not give him a biscuit. But this is, satirists are laughing at this, but they are laughing at what is for the rest of the world is a fairly bitter joke. Now, if you want to understand the Russian mindset or the Putin mindset, you have to look at and examine certain facts. Let us see why Russian troops have seized Chernobyl. Right? It's one of the important objectives, clearly. That was part of one of the important war objectives. Now, President Putin has been using this term over and over again, that he wants the denuclearization of Ukraine. Now, he knows, as anyone else knows, that during the Soviet days, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Now, by consensus and consent and agreement, that was dismantled. But nobody really knows, at least that's what Moscow says, how much of it was dismantled. Let me give you a fact which I think you might find startling. Right? In 2015, Ukraine had 220,000 tons of enriched uranium. Now, according to IAEA records, some of it has definitely been sold to various countries. But most of it is now been placed under the category of depleted and missing. Where is it? Right? Now, if somebody asks these questions, as President Putin is asking these questions, they cannot be brushed aside. If, for example, his ally Belarus had a similar disappearing act of enriched uranium, don't you think that every Western capital would have been shouting from the mountaintops, from all the Alps, right? Where is it? So I think, it is very, very immature, very, very short-sighted to dismiss Russia's concerns as we try and find new equations and new balances, which is a constant reality in international affairs. And this historically, I'm afraid, Western European powers seem to have done for many centuries, for long, all through even the Tsarist regimes and so on and so forth. The tendency to underestimate Russia has been one of the biggest flaws of West European thinking. Russia has never been as weak as they think. Of course, sometimes it has never been as strong as sometimes the Russians think, but that is different, different story. It is certainly more important that Western Europeans have underestimated Russia, leading to very serious problems such as we are seeing today.
So, where do we go from here as far as Russia Ukraine resolution and some kind of normalcy being restored, sir?
I think that's these are processes. You know, I think, as I said before, that as a war leader, President Putin would know that whether his objectives at the moment, his objectives, as far as I can see it, would be that the division of Ukraine into now 3 zones, right, which would be the eastern provinces of Luhansk and
Luhansk.
sorry, the other name is slipping my mind. And then, as you know, Ukraine has never been quite in the demographically, it has been demographically divided into Western Ukraine, which is more Russian and Russian Orthodox Church, and Eastern Ukraine, which is more Russian and Russian Orthodox Church, and West, which is more Catholic, and so on and so forth. That doesn't, mean that it is not one country, but these are the tensions that have developed. He has, I think, in his terms, established the quote unquote independence of the regions. So that's one war objective. Second, with Chernobyl, I think he can be safely assumed that he has ensured that Ukraine's nuclear program, either public or private or secret, can now never be outside Russia's range, right, or vision. That is an important war objective. Third would probably be a regime change in that. That is something that will not be determined, I think, by conflict. It will be determined by talks and by discussions and the process forward. But I think this is it. Now, when our Prime Minister, India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, called for a ceasefire, there is, I think there is some political weight behind and political assessment behind this call. That is that the war objectives were on the brink of being achieved by at least one party, and therefore time had come for the diplomatic maneuvers to resume, so that a final agreement could be created. I think Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov has also hinted that yes, the time for diplomacy has returned. I think that those, particularly in the West, who have a vested interest in this conflict, and their vested interest comes from the fact that they are not putting their bodies on the line. They are asking the Ukrainians to die. They might continue to keep blaring the trumpets of war. Certainly, the West's defense industry now will see this as another golden opportunity for a large number of countries to increase their military spending, at the top of which is likely to be Germany now. All the Germans like to do their own manufacturing rather than depend on outside sources. But I think the time for diplomacy may come sooner rather than later. This is also a measure. I mean, India has no effective role as a nation to play in that region, and I think that is very sensible, because it's maturity demands that sometimes you should measure your response with calibration and care, which we have done. But Prime Minister Modi's voice represents his own personal standing in world affairs, which he has developed over the last 7 years, and which is a very important and credible voice. And I think that voice will be heard at some point. The responses will come. And you can see both the Russians, Moscow is listening, and the Ukrainians, although they are very upset that we have not taken a kind of pro-American stand on this issue. They too have been asking for this Prime Minister Modi's voice to be the, let's say, the bridge, the diplomatic bridge between the two sides. Of course, what will happen in reality is something that we will have to wait and see.
So if we look back at the period 2017 to 2020, when this issue of Ukraine loomed, that was during the presidency of President Trump. Trump and Putin seems to have, along with Ukraine, kept this issue away, and everything seemed to be normal. So would the circumstances have been different had President Trump been in power as a president?
Well, one of the things I will say, it is not very fashionable to praise President Trump, and certainly he managed to antagonize enough American voters to lose the White House. But, in terms of foreign policy, I think there might be nostalgia for the Trump years, because he did make some very significant achievements, right? The most important thing about him is that he understood the balance between America's strength and America's appetite. And I think you should probably think about what I said to find, because America's appetite, sometimes exceeds America's strength. And when it comes to taking pain, it sometimes falls below America's strength. And how to manage these variables requires a very, very fine art of policy making. He achieved the Abraham Accords. If anyone else, if Barack Obama had achieved America awards, he would have got 4 Nobel Prize for peace, Nobel Prizes for peace. He got 1 Nobel Prize for peace merely for winning an election. So I think the President Trump, but the biggest strength of President Trump is not very visible. And I think, I can only speculate, that President Putin recognized that, which is that Trump's strength lay in being unpredictable. You could not guarantee that he would remain quiet. Right? But as I said, he got the measure of the Barack Biden White House in 2014, and he's got the measure of the Biden-Kamala Harris White House in 2022 or 2021. And he knows that the Biden Democrats will buckle. And I think that's what we have seen.
I think it's a very great, probably one of the best foreign policy years was 2017 to 2020. As you rightly said, the world was quiet. There was no interventions. I think the West Asia Peace Accord was one of the most compelling accomplishments under the Trump era. And today, Mr. Naftali Bennett is going around many of the West Asian countries striking partnerships. And if you roll the clock back, I think, it is something which unheard of. But anyway, so that's on Trump. So the build-up in NATO countries.
I think our friend Shri here wants to intervene. I don't know.
Yes, I had to start in the middle of a very engrossing conversation. Viewers, we have been trying to get hold of Sri Mohandas Pai. He's actually on the road, and he's not able to connect reliably. We're continuing to try, and we will keep you posted on that. And Sridharji, I think the audience wants to know, what is the Russian mindset? In other words, like we would like Mr. Akbar to look into the crystal ball and predict what else Putin might be doing. I'm sure this question is in your list of questions. I just wanted to make sure that that's going to be addressed. Please go ahead, sir.
It's you have to be a very, very famous astrologer to look into a crystal ball or in the fog of war. But I think I have addressed this question in different ways. One, by saying that President Putin is not a leader who would go to war without a war objective. And I think, as in Crimea, his war objectives will stop with the new normal. The new normal is the definition of spheres of influence in which Ukraine, Belarus, and so on will be part of the Moscow sphere of influence, and the NATO sphere of influence will end at a line Romania, Poland, Baltics. This is my assessment of the present situation. May I use this opportunity, since we are always going to be short of time, to discuss the real implications of what this has done. And here, let me make a very important, what I believe that is a very important, that the real implications, what we are seeing it, will not be in the future, in the immediate future of the rest of Europe. I think they will, after all the shouting and so on has died down, there will be a new kind of equation built in Europe. But the real implications will be in the Pacific. And in the Pacific, America's power will be tested. It will be tested over Taiwan, it will be tested over Korea, it will be tested in a kind of
Japan,
consequential
probably,
way,
yeah.
over Japan, with Japan. And does America have the will, the muscle, and the readiness to put the kind of sacrifice required to protect its strategic interests, right? And I can tell you that if Washington, sorry, not America, I should not say America really, because America might be a different entity, but if Washington behaves in the Pacific in the manner in which it has behaved in the Ukraine, it is all a kind of a shouting match rather than a real conflict, then we will see the end of the American era. Of that, I have no doubt. America will have to take a stand if it wants to remain a credible superpower, and it will have to take a position in the Pacific. That will be its next challenge.
Right.
Thank you so much, Akbarji. Just 1 second. Sridharji, before I rudely interrupted you, I think I'd like you to go back to that question and continue hosting this show, sir. I'm so sorry for the rude interruption. I'm still continuing to try and get TV Mohandas Pai. I will go offline and try to do that, and you can continue with your question, Sridharji.
No, I think we have covered most of the issues, and Sriji, when she interrupted, I think the former Home Minister for State had already answered the strategic objectives of Russia. I think he has clearly redrawn the border. The only adjacent question that I had is, which is the more recent, just in the last 24 hours, the press reports are coming out that he has now asked Finland and Sweden not to go after NATO. Should that be the case, he will intervene. It was not before, but the Sweden and Finland seems to be coming into the question or equation in his objectives. And if you have any thoughts around that, we'd like to hear your thoughts, sir.
Well, at the moment, I think action on the ground will not extend beyond the present sphere. That's my assessment. As I said, in the fog of war, when somebody feels the need just to put some extra pressure on the region, then you use various forms of various instruments, including making statements. You will recall that just before the war began, uh, President Putin warned the West that if they intervened, there would be unimaginable price to pay. Right? This is the kind of threat which has a certain use, but you also need an adversary who can call you
Right.
on that. And he has also been, I must say, referring more than once to the Cuba crisis of '62, in which America took the position that Moscow has taken now vis-a-vis Ukraine, that we cannot allow nuclear arsenals and NATO so close to our borders. So this is part of the rhetoric. I think simultaneously with that, we must also hear the fact that I think some spade work is being done for a dialogue between Kiev and Moscow. And but we are in the middle of a conflict. We can never be certain how the next 48 hours will go. Nobody can be certain. We can only make some projections, but there can be no certainty on these issues. This is a continuing story, and I'm sure if we get a chance to meet again for another 40 minutes, we might have many more different things to discuss.
I'm sure we'll do that. We'll do that. But just not to let go of this opportunity to wrap up, I think you touched on the potential consequences to the Indo-Pacific as a result of the fallout of what is happening in Western Europe, and more specifically around the Russian sphere of influence. So how do you see? There's a lot of trilateral partnerships, and India seems to be at the epicenter of many of those trilateral partnerships. So is there a deterrent strategy being built, accepting the fact that America may be fast receding and losing the power of influence in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, let's be very clear about one thing, that in the Pacific Quad, which is now 4 nations, the lead remains with America, right? It is the only country, in fact, it is overwhelmingly the only country with the military capacity to take a stand, to take a confrontation, if the confrontation is begun by anyone else, right? If, for example, Beijing reads something into the Ukraine situation and decides that, yes, America is not in a position, or America has no will left to defend its allies, then we will see what we will see. But really, it is up to America now. If, for example, President Putin has brought in Finland and Sweden into play, why cannot President Biden send a very clear signal to Beijing, saying that nobody should interpret what is happening as a reason to play, to indulge in adventurism in the Pacific? It would be a very clear message. But the world is waiting to hear such a message, and nothing of that sort seems to be coming so far. Once again, I have to qualify everything by saying so far.
So far. Great, great. So thank you so much for your wonderful time and sharing your tremendous insights by virtue of the work you have done, plus your own knowledge and tremendous experience sitting in the chair and dealing on the foreign policy issues. We'll certainly have another 40 minutes as things begin to clear. And before I hand it over to Sri IRG and for him to make his concluding comments. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful 45 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sridhar. Thank you.
Akbarji, that was a fascinating sharing of views, and I think a lot of our viewers learned a lot of new things. You gave the 360-degree perspective of looking at something, not just from the eyes of last 48 hours or last 72 hours, but going back and then coming back up to the front. So that was a very good telescope in and out very, very wonderful way to do it. With your permission, sir, I have a few questions. Somebody has asked a question on Twitter, and maybe one or two questions that is in this YouTube also. Would you be able to take these questions, sir?
Yeah, but very quickly, Sridhar, I have a
Yeah,
few.
yeah.
Sri, sorry, I have
Yeah.
something. Somebody really,
Very, very
literally.
quick. Very quick, very quick. Revati wants to know, what is the significance of India staying out of UN Security Council, voting against or for this incident?
No, I think that's a very important. Abstaining is also a decision. It's not a non-decision, right? And I think if you are positioning yourself, as India should be, to be a bridge between the at the moment belligerents, then it is important to maintain what I would call a spirit of neutrality, if in the hope that not in the hope with the purpose of being able to speak to both sides. Without that, a
Last
bridge.
last question, sir. Mahadevan wants to know, do you see an alliance of Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, and how will that affect India?
No, I think I know what our friend is talking about, and that is on everyone's dread list, as it were. But I mean, look at the way in which Pakistan and Prime Minister Imran Khan, when he went up to Moscow for the first visit in what quarter century, and it was a very cursory affair. Nothing was achieved, no agreements, including on gas and so on and so forth. President Putin, in fact, did not give too much time either. And plus, I think Pakistan itself displayed a fair degree of, lack of understanding that if a nation and a host is in the middle of a very serious conflict, you ask for a postponement, which is very rational, normal. You can't always be in control of events, and yes, you can just bill it for 6 months later. I wonder if the Prime Minister of Pakistan had this feeling that if he didn't go, he wouldn't remain Prime Minister when the next date was announced. I don't know, but
that might very well happen, sir.
Yeah, this was not shall we say, his finest performance in reverse swing.
That was a good one, reverse swing. I think that brings us to a close of today's session. Akbarji, with your permission, I'm going to go ahead and announce that we might have you back in a few weeks' time, maybe a couple of weeks' time, because the dust is going to settle a little bit. Positions will be taken, and we will kind of know what the new normal ends up being. So we can talk at that point as to what to do for the rest of the world for the new normal. And I'm sure China is waiting in the wings to do something, some mischief. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. Should India actually push back on China if it is looking at Taiwan? That's a question that everybody could ask. That could be a good point. It can't have a two-front war. So let's wait and see. Thank you so much, Akbarji. And Sridharji, thank you so much for guest hosting it for us. As always, a pleasure to have both of you gentlemen on our channel. Thank you for taking this time out on a weekend. And viewers, thank you so much. The response has been overwhelming. Please do like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to click on the bell button for notifications. Namaskar.
Thank you very, very much, Sridhar, and of course, most of all, to our viewers. Thank you really very much.